Pick up an envelope from 1850. A real one. Any archive that holds old mail will let you see one. Look at the address. There's no street number, no postal code, no apartment, just words. Something like this. To Mr. Thomas Whitfield, the brick house with the green door, near the old mill, Boston. That was it. That was the whole address. And somehow, that letter found him in a city of 136,000 people. No number on the door. Nothing we'd call an address today. Just a description, like directions a neighbor would give. And it worked. I want you to sit with that for a second, because the world before street addresses is stranger than almost anything I've looked into, and the change happened faster than you'd think. Let me show you what I mean. In the year 1800, the city of London held about 1 million people. 1 million, packed into a space smaller than most modern suburbs, and almost none of the homes had numbers. If you wanted to find someone, you asked. You walked to the nearest pub. You found a boy on the street and gave him a penny. You looked for the sign hanging above the door. Every shop, every inn, every lodging house had a painted sign, a red lion, a blue boar, a golden key. People didn't live at 15 Baker Street. They lived at the sign of the Three Compasses near Smithfield Market. That was the address system for centuries, all across Europe, all across the growing towns of the Americas, signs and landmarks and the memory of neighbors. And here's what gets me. The standard explanation says numbering came from practical need. Cities grew, mail volume grew, people needed a system. And honestly, it makes sense. London's population doubled between 1750 and 1800. Paris was bursting at the seams. Something had to give. But when you actually dig into when numbering started and why, the story turns strange. The first large-scale house numbering in Europe happened in Vienna in the year 1770, under the Empress Maria Theresa. And it wasn't for the post, it wasn't for shopkeepers, it was for the army. The Austrian historian Anton Tantner has spent his whole career on this. His book is called House Numbers, Pictures of a Forgotten History. And what he documents is this. Maria Theresa needed soldiers for her wars with Prussia. She needed to know which houses held which families, so she sent officers out with white paint and black brushes. Every house got a number, not for letters, for the draft. They were called conscription. That's the German word for conscription numbers. You can still see some of them today, faded on old buildings across Austria. Between 1770 and 1772, her officers went to work. They numbered 389,148 houses in Bohemia alone. Think about that. In under 2 years, almost 400,000 homes. Marked by hand, one building at a time. In total, Habsburg officials counted over 7 million people living in more than 1 million homes. That figure comes from Deirdre Mask. She's the author of a book called The Address Book, published in 2020. It's one of the most careful histories of addresses ever written. Prussia did something similar around the same time. So did parts of France. The pattern was consistent. Numbering houses was a military act before it was a civilian one. Before the post office cared, the army cared. Before merchants cared, tax collectors cared. Now, the standard explanation for this has real merit. States were getting bigger. Paperwork was getting bigger. Of course, they'd number houses. It's tidy. It's efficient. It's exactly what you'd expect, but it leaves something out. Because even after Vienna numbered its houses, most of Europe didn't follow. Not for decades. Not for almost 100 years. London didn't have real numbering until the 1850s. New York didn't standardize until the 1830s and 40s, and even then it was a mess. Philadelphia tried a new system in 1856. Chicago didn't settle on its grid until 1909. Vienna itself didn't add street-based numbers until May 2, 1862. Tokyo still doesn't use street addresses the way we do, not really. So we have this gap. 100 years where some cities were numbered and most weren't. 100 years where letters still arrived, where people still found each other, where trade still happened, where love letters still crossed oceans. How? This is where I went down a rabbit hole. Deirdre Mask writes about how letters actually moved in these years. In London, there were things called post office directories. Kelly's directory was the biggest one. The first edition came out in 1836. By the 1850s, it was a thick volume, thousands of pages. It listed people by name, trade, and rough location. A butcher on Drury Lane, a clockmaker near Fleet Street, a widow who took in boarders by the docks, a postman memorized his route. He knew every family. He knew who'd moved. He knew who'd died. He knew who was visiting a sister for the summer. He knew which door to knock on at what hour. He knew which dog would bite. By the 1850s, London had around 2,000 letter carriers. These men walked the same streets for years, often for decades. They were walking databases. You could address a letter to John Harris Cooper near the east gate of St. Paul's, and it would get there because a human being remembered. And it wasn't just London. In Boston, in Philadelphia, in New York, the same thing held. Local postmasters knew their regulars by sight. They knew the sound of a voice. They knew which merchant was expecting a shipment. They knew which young woman had a brother fighting out west. The system ran on memory, on faces, on the slow accumulation of small details passed from one carrier to the next over years. And that's the question that won't leave me alone. If tens of millions of people could find each other without numbers, without street names as we know them, W. Ford, without any of the things we think are essential. Let me walk you through some places, because this is where the same thing starts showing up. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. 1856. A man named John Masher proposed a new numbering plan, 100 numbers per block. Even numbers on one side, odd on the other. It's the system you probably live with today. But notice what he said about why. He said the old way caused confusion among strangers. Strangers, not locals. The residents were fine. It was outsiders who got lost. The standard explanation says Philadelphia was growing, and growth brought strangers. That's reasonable. It fits the timing, but it leaves one thing unexplained. Because Philadelphia had been growing for a century. Why did the strangers matter in 1856 and not 100 years earlier? Paris, France, 1805. Napoleon ordered every building in Paris numbered, a huge project, thousands of structures. It took years. And the reason given at the time was tax collection. Napoleon wanted to know who lived where so he could tax them, so he could find the men he wanted for his armies. Again, the standard explanation is solid. Empires run on paperwork. Of course he numbered them. But it's worth noticing that for the previous 800 years, Paris had worked without it. The city of Notre Dame, the city of the Louvre, the city that fed itself, taxed itself, governed itself for centuries. It didn't need numbers until an emperor needed soldiers. London, England, 1857. Parliament passed the Metropolis Management Act. It gave a new body the power to rename streets and renumber houses across the whole city. Before that, London had duplicate street names everywhere. Dozens of high streets, dozens of church lanes. A carrier had to know which one you meant. After 1857, the duplicates were wiped clean, streets were renamed, houses were numbered, end to end, Washington, D.C. March 3, 1863. Congress passed the act that created free city delivery. It took effect on July 1st of that year. The Postmaster General Montgomery Blair had pushed for it in his report to President Lincoln the year before. The idea actually came from a postal clerk in Cleveland. His name was Joseph Briggs. The story goes that during the Civil War, Briggs watched women stand in long lines outside the post office, in the cold, in the rain, waiting for word from husbands and sons at the front. Some got letters, some got nothing. Some got the letter that told them a son wouldn't be coming home, and they had to open it right there in the street. Briggs thought there had to be a better way. He wrote to Blair. Blair listened, and the law followed. Before this, Americans picked up their own mail. You walked to the post office and asked if anything came for you. After the act, letters came to your door. For free. But there was a catch. A big one. To qualify for the new service, a city had to have sidewalks. It had to have streetlights. It had to have named streets. And it had to have numbered houses. Those were the rules. No numbers, no delivery. In the first year alone, 65 American cities signed up. 685 letter carriers were hired. By 1900, 796 cities had free city delivery. 15,322 carriers walked their routes. Think about what that means. In less than 40 years, the United States changed completely. From a country where most people fetched their own mail, to a country where mail came to numbered doors, all because of one law, all because of one reform. Tokyo, Japan. Even now, most buildings in Tokyo don't have street addresses the way we think of them. Streets are not named. Blocks are numbered. Buildings within blocks are numbered by the order they were built, not by their place on the road, by their age. And 13 million people live there. And the city works. The mail arrives. Pizza gets delivered. That one stops me every time, because it shows our system isn't the only way. It's just one way. And it's newer than we think. Chicago, Illinois, 1909. An engineer named Edward Brennan finally got his grid system approved. State Street would be the 0 point. Every block would be 100 numbers. Took him 14 years of arguing. 14 years. Just to get a city of 2 million people to agree on where the numbers should start. Berlin, Madrid, Rome. The same story in each one. Somewhere between 1850 and 1900, they all settled on numbered grids, all within 50 years of each other. Not in one country, not in two. Across the world. And I keep asking myself, what actually happened in those 50 years? Here's where I want to be careful, because I'm not going to tell you something was hidden. I don't think it was. What I think is that the connection hasn't been studied, not in this specific way. The British Postal Museum in London holds records of letter carrier routes from the 1830s through the 1870s, handwritten notebooks, route maps, notes from postmen about the families they delivered to. Some of these notebooks list addresses that aren't really addresses at all. They're little stories. The Widow Brown. 3 doors from the baker on Mercer Street, her son is at sea. That sits in a catalog. Anyone can request access. Very few people have read it in the context I'm talking about. The United States National Archives holds the original free city delivery proposals from 1862, including the debates in Congress about whether it would even work. The arguments against it are fascinating. Some representatives thought Americans were too independent to accept having mail brought to their door. They wanted to keep going to the post office themselves. They liked the walk. They liked the talk. They liked knowing the postmaster's face. One senator argued the whole idea was un-American. He said a man should come for his own letters, that the trip itself was part of being a citizen. You met your neighbors on the way. You heard the news. You traded gossip at the counter. That connection between home delivery and the quiet loss of something else hasn't been examined in depth. And the gap I keep seeing is this. The buildings exist. The laws exist. But the record of how people actually found each other before all this, mostly doesn't. Not because anyone destroyed it. Because nobody wrote it down. The knowledge lived in the heads of letter carriers, in the memory of shopkeepers, in the chatter of neighbors. And when those people died, it went with them. That's the gap. It's not hidden. It's just quiet. Everything I've shown you so far is documented. You can look it up. The dates, the acts, the postal records. What comes next is me thinking out loud. What if the move to numbered addresses wasn't really about mail at all? Here's scenario 1. What if house numbering was always about the state seeing its citizens? Vienna did it for the draft. Napoleon did it for taxes. London did it during a time of huge social unrest. The United States did it during the Civil War. Every major numbering push lines up with a government trying to count, tax, draft, or track its people. The evidence supporting this is the timing itself. What would disprove it? Finding one major numbering project driven purely by civilian demand, with no state interest at all. I haven't found one, but I haven't looked everywhere. Scenario 2. What if the old system was actually better at something we've lost? Think about what the brick house with the green door near the mill requires. It requires a community where people know each other, where a stranger can ask directions and get them, where letter carriers are neighbors, not employees. The old address assumed a witness, someone who could point, someone who would walk you there if you asked. The new address assumes nothing, just a number on a map. You don't need to know anyone. You don't need to ask anyone. You don't even need to speak the language. When we switched to numbers, we made the system work for strangers, but we may have made it stop working for communities. The evidence here is thin. What would disprove it, showing that community ties stayed strong after the switch, or were already weak before? Both are possible. Neither has really been studied this way. This one I'm least sure of. What if the speed of the change points to something we haven't named yet? Because technologies don't usually spread this evenly. Railroads took longer, telegraphs took longer, electricity took much longer. But house numbering standardized across continents in about 2 generations. That's fast, uncomfortably fast. What supports it is the timing data itself. What would disprove it, showing the spread was actually messier and slower. With much more regional variation than I'm describing, historians of specific cities would know better than I do. These aren't answers, they're directions, and nobody's walked down them yet. So go back to that envelope, the one from 1850. The brick house, the green door, the old mill. Boston, it's still out there, in some archive, real paper, real ink, real handwriting, from a real person. Someone who trusted that description to carry their words across an ocean, to someone they loved, and it arrived. That's the part I can't get past. It arrived. You can visit these archives. You can hold the envelopes. You can read the addresses that aren't addresses. You can see it with your own eyes. A world where tens of millions of people found each other, with nothing but stories and memory and the patience of a stranger on a street corner. That world existed. Inside the lifetime of people whose grandchildren are still alive, not 1,000 years ago, not even 200, just a few generations back, close enough to touch, and we replaced it in 50 years, without ever asking what we were giving up.